Imagine yourself standing in a muddy trench, rain pouring mercilessly, your body shivering with cold, and then suddenly the sky explodes with thousands of artillery shells falling like an iron storm straight from hell. How could anyone survive when the world itself had turned into a giant graveyard? This was the First World War, not just a war, but a machine built to grind human lives. Here, hundreds of thousands died just to seize a patch of land no bigger than a football field. And the most insane part? Sometimes victory wasn't measured by who advanced the furthest, but by who could endure the longest inside that hell of mud and blood.
Before the trenches filled with mud and blood, before the cannons roared like eternal thunder, the early 20th century was already a boiling pot just waiting to explode. Europe at the time was swollen with pride. Britain, Germany, France, Russia, all racing to prove who ruled the world, who had the biggest navy, the toughest army, the flashiest new technology. It was like an arms wrestling contest, except the muscles were millions of soldiers and tons of steel artillery. But beneath the pride lay something more dangerous: secret alliances. Nations swore oaths. If one was attacked, the others would march. The result? Europe became a mousetrap. Once one trigger was pulled, everyone got caught. And it happened. In 1914, an Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was shot in Sarajevo by a young nationalist. On its own, just another political assassination. But thanks to the web of alliances, the shock spread like falling dominoes. Austria struck at Serbia. Russia defended Serbia. Germany backed Austria. France and Britain joined in. Boom, the whole continent was on fire. Behind it all was the dream of empire. Great powers wanted colonies, markets, resources, and this war became their ticket to prove who was the true boss of the world. So when war finally erupted, it wasn't just about one dead prince. It was about arrogance, greed, and fear, carefully fed for years. Ordinary people only knew one thing: they were dragged into a hell they never asked for. Imagine you're a farmer, fresh from the harvest, when a letter of conscription arrives. Tomorrow, you're no longer a son, a father, a husband. You're a soldier. From field to trench, from a warm home to a pit of mud, from hope of life to the gamble of death. And that was the stage being set. A world that called itself modern, full of progress, yet chose the most primitive act of all: killing each other for the sake of flags. The early 20th century was burning with pride and ego. Europe's great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, were like reckless teenagers, each desperate to prove their strength. The spark? A single bullet. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo. One gunshot, and Europe went up in flames. Suddenly, millions of young men who should have been studying, working, or falling in love in the park were thrown onto the front lines. No longer free individuals, they became pawns in the political chess game of kings and emperors. And then came the nightmare: trench warfare. Hundreds of kilometers of giant ditches became both home and grave. Soldiers stood in knee-deep, filthy water, with corpses sinking into the mud. Rats the size of cats gnawed on human remains. Every day, men breathed the stench of blood, gunpowder, and rotting flesh. You'd think the bullets were the worst part. They weren't. The real terror was poison gas. Imagine sitting at a trench when a yellow-green fog creeps toward you. It isn't fog. It's mustard gas, chlorine gas. One breath and your lungs ignite. Eyes burn blind. Throats blister. Men claw at the air as their lungs dissolve. Many didn't die from bullets, but from breathing. And even if you survived the gas, the shells, the shrapnel, there was another killer: time. Year after year, soldiers lived in this same fear, night after night, haunted by nightmares, morning after morning, praying that today wouldn't be their turn to fall. On paper, the generals called it strategy, but for the men in the mud, it meant only this: advance, shoot, die. Sometimes they were ordered to charge enemy lines just to seize a patch of ground no bigger than a football field, at the cost of thousands of lives. That was the true horror of World War I. Not just a clash of nations, but a clash between humanity and sheer absurdity. A war where the system itself felt more insane than the fighting.
And this was the moment when the world became an open hell. World War I reached its peak with battles so monstrous it was as if the earth itself rejected humanity. Look at the Battle of the Somme, 1916. 1 million casualties just to seize a few muddy kilometers. On the very first day, more than 57,000 British soldiers fell, the deadliest single day in their history. Imagine it, thousands of bodies collapsing within hours, rain mixing with blood, the ground turning into a sea of human flesh. Then Verdun, madness made into war. For 9 endless months, France and Germany pounded each other, millions of shells reducing the ancient city to dust. The French motto was only 3 words: "They shall not pass." And they didn't. But the price? Hundreds of thousands of lives sacrificed to defend a pile of rubble. Don't think the rear lines were any safer. Field hospitals overflowed with men whose faces were shattered, legs blown away, skin burned to ash. Doctors ran out of morphine, so many surgeries were done without anesthesia. Imagine someone sawing off your leg while you're wide awake. That was real. That was common. And if your body survived, your mind might not. Countless soldiers returned with what they called shell shock, what we now know as war trauma. Hands shaking endlessly, nightmares that made them scream in the dark, eyes empty, as if their souls were still trapped in the trenches of Verdun. At that point, it wasn't about winning or losing anymore. This war was a theater of absurdity, where the only true victor was death. But wait, this tragedy wasn't only about trenches, bullets, and bodies piled high. There was something far more insidious, quieter, and yet just as decisive. Did you know many soldiers didn't die from bullets at all, but from hunger and disease? Flies, rats, and lice proved deadlier than bayonets. And then came the Spanish flu, exploding at the war's end, killing millions, more than all the bombs and bullets combined. The war wasn't just fought on the battlefield, but inside the human body itself. And here's the cruelest contrast. While poor soldiers drowned in mud and blood, the war's leaders sat comfortably in lavish rooms, sipping wine, smoking cigars, drawing lines on maps. A single stroke of the pen meant thousands would march to their deaths, human lives reduced to numbers on a page. Then comes the bitterest twist of all. World War I was called the war to end all wars, the final conflict, they said, that would bring eternal peace. But the truth? It was only the seed of the next. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany so harshly that it planted the flames of vengeance, giving rise to a man named Adolf Hitler. So the blood spilled in the trenches of the Somme and Verdun wasn't an ending. It was just the prologue to something far worse. Imagine being a soldier who somehow survived. You lost friends, limbs, and pieces of your soul, only to come home and realize all that suffering wasn't the end at all, but merely the doorway to an even darker war. That's the crueltest of World War I. The so-called last war became the prelude to the next, as if the world itself had conspired with death, allowing history to repeat its nightmare. And so World War I closed its curtain with millions of corpses, shattered lands, and souls that would never be whole again. But the most terrifying part wasn't just the blood spilled. It was the fact that humanity proved itself capable of repeating the same stupidity. Imagine being one of the soldiers who made it home. You knock on your own door in a tattered uniform, longing for a warm embrace. But instead, you're met with strange eyes. Your child no longer recognizes your face, and neighbors whisper, "He's not the same man anymore." Because war doesn't only steal the dead, it robs the living of their very souls. And the world? The world simply records it in history books, line after line, number after number, as if suffering could be tallied by calculator. But behind every number, there was a name, a voice, a dream buried in the mud of the trenches. So when someone calls war heroic, ask yourself, heroic for whom? For the nameless soldiers thrown into mass graves? Or for the men who signed treaties at polished tables, then slept soundly in their beds? History does not give us fairy tales, it gives us mirrors. And World War I is the darkest of them all. Proof that a single political decision can shatter millions of lives, and that the world rarely learns from its own scars. Perhaps its greatest lesson is this: bullets may stop, cannons may fall silent, but the wounds left by war, they live on, etched into bodies, carved into memories, and carried in the blood of generations.